Well, good morning. Thank you for joining with us today. We'll just make a few brief introductory remarks before we actually begin with any new material to give people some to check into our broadcast, our live broadcast. Hopefully, where you are this morning, you're having as good weather as we are in north central Arkansas, here in the Mountain Home area. Beautiful, sunny Friday morning. It's hard to believe it's already May 1st. Seems like just a very short time ago, we were turning the calendar to April. And even though over the past month or so, our activities have been somewhat limited, we had to adjust our schedules. Many of us are staying home a lot more than we normally would, practicing the social distancing and everything. Still, the time seems to move pretty quickly. I suppose that it depends on how busy you are and how many things you have around the house that can keep you busy, or if you have a workshop. I was talking to someone the other day, and he said that he has a workshop so that he can go down there and social distance even from his wife. So sometimes that's a good thing too, I suppose. But it's a beautiful, beautiful morning here on Friday, May the 1st. By way of some brief review of some things that we've talked about to this point in our outline on how to study the Bible, just briefly review the points, the first 7 points that we've studied to this point in our series. So remember, first of all, there is the period of perfection that covers Genesis chapters 1 and 2. And then there is the problem of sin from Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 through 13. There's the purpose of God, Genesis chapter 3, verses 14 and 15. And then there's the promise of redemption, beginning in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, with a promise that God made to Abraham. Through the remainder of the book of Genesis, we find that promise is then repeated to Abraham's son Isaac and to Isaac's son Jacob. And then with the opening of the book of Exodus, we come to the next point of our outline, and that is the pictures of redemption. Because in those historical books from Exodus all the way through Esther, we find a number of types or pictures of what God's redemption is going to be like. We pointed out that sometimes it comes in the form of people, sometimes it comes in the form of institutions, sometimes it comes in the form of events that take place during that time. And then we came to the poems of redemption that cover the books of Job through the Song of Solomon. Then our last lesson, we spent actually 2 times on the point of number 7, the prophecies of redemption. And we notice in our first lesson, they're prophecies of the personal Messiah, that is the character and nature of the man himself who filled that role, who was the Lord's anointed. Then their second lesson, we pointed out that there were also prophecies of the Messianic age, that is the age of the church, from Acts chapter 3, where Peter says about verse 24, that yea, from Samuel and all the prophets who followed after, as many as have spoken, have likewise foretold of these days. And the expression these days refer to the days of the church, the last days, the last dispensation in which God will deal with men's sins, and that is through the blood of his son Jesus Christ, and with those who are covered by that blood and added to his church. Well, today we come to point number 8 in our outline. Remember, we said that we borrowed the main points of the outline from Franklin Camp. His point number 8 was the pause of redemption. The pause, P-A-U-S-E. Because we're studying today not from the Bible itself, but from the time between the Old and the New Testaments. As we've often said, there's a lot that went on in your Bible on that one blank page between Malachi chapter 4 and Matthew chapter 1. If we have only the Bible in front of us, we're kind of perplexed perhaps when we begin reading certain things in the New Testament about the political situation or the religious situation that are different from what we find in the Old Testament. And so there needs to be some explanation for that. And the explanation comes by looking at the history that took place between Malachi chapter 4 and Matthew chapter 1. Between the close of the Old Testament, about 430 years before Christ, until the opening of the New Testament. So as we study this, I'm going to use as our text this morning Galatians chapter 4 and verse 4. Paul there says that when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman and born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive the adoption of sons. Paul uses an expression there, the fullness of time. A paraphrase of that might be, when the time was exactly right, God sent his Son. Well, what made the time right for Jesus to appear when he did? When we open the New Testament at the beginning of what we call the first century AD, what made that the right time? Well, a lot of that goes back to what occurred between the end of Malachi and the beginning of Matthew. That is, between the Old Testament history and the opening of New Testament history. As we said, if the Bible is all we had in front of us, we wouldn't know anything about all those things that happened. Many biblical scholars refer to these as the silent years. Others refer to it as the intertestamental period, the between the testament period. But when we look at world history, we find that a lot of things went on during those 400 years. Now, we've pointed out in other lessons that a lot can happen in 400 years, can't it? If you go back 400 years from where we're living in 1620, even in our own country, the Jamestown colony was only 13 years old. It would still be another 2 years before the Mayflower set forth and landed at Plymouth Rock in modern day Massachusetts. So think of all the changes that have taken place in the 400 years of history going back from our time. Well, a lot of changes took place in the 400 years between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. As a matter of fact, when the Old Testament ended, the Jews were being ruled by the Persian Empire. But when the New Testament opens, we find that they're being ruled by the Romans. And if we didn't have anything in between, we would be totally unaware of the fact that there was another great empire that came in between those two. If you remember back in Daniel, in the second chapter, Daniel interprets a dream for the king Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. And then in Daniel chapter 7, he himself is given visions of a succession of world empires that parallel those from Daniel chapter 2. But those empires were that Nebuchadnezzar, representing Babylon, was the head of gold. After him would come a kingdom that would also be great, but still inferior, represented by silver, which was the Medo-Persian Empire. And then after that would come another kingdom that would be somewhat inferior to that, represented by bronze, which was the Greek Empire. And then after that would be the empire represented by iron, the iron legs and the feet of iron mixed with clay, which would be the Roman Empire. And if you remember in our last lesson, we pointed out that in Daniel 2 and verse 44, Daniel said that it would be in the days of these kings, that is, of the last kings, the days of the Romans, that God would set up his kingdom that would never be destroyed. And of course, that's what we find happening in the New Testament, especially after the public ministry of Jesus and in the book of Acts. But as we said, we begin there with Babylon and then Persia and then Greece and then Rome. All four of those empires made a contribution to making the time exactly right for Jesus to appear on the history of the world. We find, for example, that it was due to the Babylonian captivity that the synagogue developed among the Jews. Now, if you remember in the Old Testament, you don't read of synagogues. I believe there's one time in the King James Version where the word synagogue appears in one of the Psalms. Probably there it has reference to a general assembly, because that's what the word means originally. But we find that by the time we open the New Testament, synagogues are everywhere. They're not only outside of Palestine, they're in nearly every town in Palestine. Several different ones were within the city confines of Jerusalem itself, you might say within the shadow of the temple. Well, why were there synagogues? Where did they come from? Well, the need for it came from when the people were scattered from their homeland and when the Babylonians had burned the temple. As they're scattered in all these different lands, in different places, they wanted a way that they could keep together. And they began to focus back on the law. And as we said, it probably began during the days of the Babylonian Empire. We may have a forerunner of it in the book of Ezekiel, where the captives, where the exiles were coming to Ezekiel and gathering together to hear him and to hear what he had to say. And that may be kind of the forerunner, so to speak, of the synagogue. It developed even further, though, through the time of the Persian and Greek empires. And by the time of the New Testament, synagogues were everywhere. We find that this gave a really good place for Jesus to go and to begin his teaching. Many times in the gospel accounts, we find that Jesus would enter a synagogue on the Sabbath and he would teach there. We find later in the book of Acts that it was at the synagogue where Paul would go when he would first enter into a town to preach. He would go first to the synagogue and he would open up their scriptures with them and reason with them and show them, here's what your scriptures say regarding the coming Messiah. Here is the life of Jesus, and here is how he fulfilled those scriptures. And so the synagogue became, as someone has said, the cradle for the Lord's church, because it was from there that, and as James in Acts chapter 15 says, Moses has from old time been read in every city. That is because of the synagogues. And so it became a very natural starting point for missionaries. Jesus used it in his public ministry, and we find that Paul especially used it during his missionary journeys. So the synagogue, the rise of the synagogue, helped make it a good time, the fullness of time, the perfect time, when the time was exactly right for Jesus to come forth. And then the Persian Empire, what they did to contribute to the time being right, when they took over from the Babylonians, their philosophy was totally different. Rather than keeping people totally subjugated, now they did rule over them, but Cyrus, the first king of Persia, after he conquered Babylon, he allowed the Jews, as many as wanted to, throughout his entire empire. And remember, it now covered even more territory than Babylon had, because he had a pretty good kingdom before, and now he's incorporated the entire Babylonian empire and even adds Egypt to it. Well, any Jews, wherever they're living in my empire, you can go back to Jerusalem and you can rebuild your temple. And then later, Artaxerxes the first, who would be about the great-grandson, I believe, or great-great-grandson of Cyrus. I think he would be the grandson of Darius, the next king. But at any rate, he allowed Ezra to go back to Jerusalem and restore the law, to establish the reading of the law, the teaching of the law, and the practice of the law. And then later in his reign, he allowed Nehemiah to go back and to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem. And so he gives them a nucleus, and he helps them to have this center back in Jerusalem. Now, of course, they had a lot of issues and a lot of problems, and they faced a great deal of persecution, and more Jews remained in the lands where they had been dispersed than they then went back to Jerusalem. But still, there's the nucleus there with the restoration of the worship of the Lord. That's what the Persians contributed. And then when the Persians fell to the Greeks, and it happened very rapidly with the rise of a man by the name of Alexander the Great, who in a period of just very little more than 12 years, he took over from his father, Philip of Macedon, who was assassinated when Alexander was only about 20 years of age. And within 12 years or so, he had expanded his empire all the way across Persia, all the way into India. And he died before his 33rd birthday. And when he died, he didn't leave an heir. So his succession were 4 generals of his army. 2 of them especially have a great deal to do with this history of the Jews between the Old and the New Testaments. But those 2 were the Ptolemies of Egypt in the south, and then you had the Seleucids in the north. The Ptolemies had their capital city in Alexandria, Egypt. The Seleucids had their capital city of Antioch of Syria. But those 2 powers, and both of them being Greeks, but they were somewhat rivals, but they had a great impact on the history of the Jews during this time. But the great contribution that the Greek Empire made to the fullness of time, for the time being exactly right, was their language, because their language became nearly universal. And even Jews in Palestine, Even though they're Aramaic, and that was also one of the contributions of the Persian Empire, changed their language, the everyday common language of the people, from Hebrew to Aramaic, so that when their Hebrew scriptures were read, they needed it to be translated for them or made plain to them so they could understand it. You read that even in Nehemiah chapter 8 and verse 8. But even though they commonly spoke Aramaic, most of them would have known Greek. But then we find that when the Septuagint, that is the Old Testament, was translated into Greek in Alexandria, Egypt in the 2nd century or 3rd century BC, and then you find that the New Testament itself is written in Greek, and you find that Paul, in his preaching, he could go into synagogues or he could go wherever, and he could teach them in the Greek language. And so that was the great contribution of the Greek Empire to the fullness of times. And then you have the Romans. And what the Romans contributed was, first of all, the Roman peace, the Pax Romana, as it was known in Latin. Now, that Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was very strictly enforced and oftentimes very harshly by a very powerful and ruthless Roman army. But it did establish a great deal of security, safety, and peace in the 1st century world. But then the second great thing that they contributed was a system of roads and transportation. And while that doesn't impact the earthly ministry of Jesus as much, it certainly impacted the travels of the Apostle Paul. And especially since he had the privilege of Roman citizenship, it opened a lot of doors for him. There were a lot of advantages that he had because of things that came from the Roman Empire. Now, in all fairness, there's another side of that story. Each one of those empires, besides making these contributions, and these contributions in some ways were unknown to them. They were not necessarily things that they intended to do. But they also, on the negative side, created a lot of problems for the Jews. But another thing that you'll notice when you open your New Testament, not only are you reading about synagogues and things, but you're reading about Pharisees and Sadducees and Herodians and Zealots. And then there's another sect of the Jews, another division known as the Essenes. They're not mentioned by name in the New Testament, but we know of them from a body of literature that was discovered around the Dead Sea back in the late 1940s, the Dead Sea Scrolls. But at any rate, you have all these different divisions among the Jews. You don't read of any of those in the Old Testament. Where did they come from? Well, they come because of clashes and divisions, and sometimes religious, sometimes political, among the Jews during this time between Malachi and Matthew, between the Old and the New Testaments. And they arose, and sometimes they fought each other bitterly, sometimes they could coincide peacefully, but a lot of times there were there were some great power struggles among them. And so you have those divisions among them. You read in the New Testament of scribes and lawyers. To my knowledge, the only scribe you read about in the Old Testament is Ezra. Ezra the scribe, who was also a priest, the one who went back to Jerusalem in the 7th year of Artaxerxes, and you read of that in Ezra chapter 7. Well, in the New Testament, you find scribes, and some translations also refer to them as lawyers. They are experts in the law. But by the time of the New Testament, they were not only experts in the law, they were also experts in the oral traditions that had grown up around the law. And you'll find that a lot of times in the New Testament, Pharisees and scribes are often named together or banded together. They were oftentimes found together. The scribes mostly were from the Pharisaic party, and you'll find that there is a lot of friction between them and Jesus. They're often making accusations against Jesus or his disciples for violating the law. Well, they weren't violating the law. They were violating some of the oral traditions that were no part of the law of God. Jesus never violated the law of his heavenly Father. So you have all these different things that you read about in the New Testament that you don't find in the Old Testament. The more we know of the history between the Old and the New Testaments, the better understanding we'll have of these things as they come up in the New Testament. There's a lot of material out there that you can read. A lot of books have been written strictly on the intertestamental period. Most of them are fairly small books. You can find information on the internet. If you just Google intertestamental period, you'll probably come up with a lot of different things. Some study Bibles have good material in between the Old and the New Testament to describe a lot of these things. But I hope that you'll maybe take advantage of the opportunity to look more deeply into this. A lot of you don't like history as much as I do, so it doesn't excite you as much. But when I read of some of that history, it's very vibrant. And especially when you read of Alexander the Great and to think of what he accomplished in such a short time and at such a young age, it's just absolutely remarkable. But all of that took place between the Old and the New Testaments. So this is the pause of redemption as things are working toward, and there are these contributions made toward making it the fullness of time for the Lord to send his Son, Jesus the Christ. Well, thank you for joining us this morning. We hope you'll join us again Sunday morning at 10:30 for our 10:30 worship period. 5 o'clock Sunday evening, we'll be back on Facebook Live for our Sunday evening lesson. And then next Tuesday morning at 10:30, we'll resume our lessons on how to study the Bible. Thank you for being with us. And until Sunday, may the Lord richly bless you and keep you.